Black Lives Matter means to embrace one's Black heritage and not be ashamed or be afraid, because society can sometimes look down upon being Black. And to embrace your Black culture and to express the celebration of it is what Black Lives Matter is. It's a movement of sharing it with others that we are Black, we are proud, our legacy is loud, and we're not going to be ashamed of it.
Hi, and welcome to our podcast. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Mia Sandino, and I am joined by Pineo-Cavanaugh and Mira Robinson.
Today we're going to be talking about Black Lives Matter, what it is, how it got started, and why it's so controversial.
So let's start off with what Black Lives Matter and hashtag Black Lives Matter are all about. Their website defines their hashtag as an online forum intended to build connections between Black people and their allies to fight anti-Black racism, to spark dialogue among Black people, and to facilitate the types of connections necessary to encourage social action and engagement.
We wanted to start by talking about what the major criticisms of the Black Lives Matter movement are. Despite the strong support it receives, conservative figures like Bill O'Reilly often claim that Black Lives Matter is radical and violent.
We have the NAACP, and we have a number of other African American groups designed to do that in a peaceful way. So, I mean, if you don't think Black Lives Matter is radical, I mean, you must know they're radical, right?
Although O'Reilly's claim is to an extent based in some truth, the violence he would be referring to, that of the Ferguson riots, that violence was not condoned by the leaders of Black Lives Matter, and in fact, most members of the movement called those violent protesters out and insisted that they stop their actions.
Bill O'Reilly is criticizing the reaction of African Americans, claiming that their protests and demands and anger are out of line. But the piece that's missing is that he doesn't stop to consider why are African Americans angry, what has driven them to the point where they are demanding change, and how would any of us feel if we were systematically discriminated against throughout the duration of our lives? I mean, it's a pretty normal reaction.
White oppressors of Black Lives Matter still think that they're being oppressed when they're not being oppressed. They see the Black Lives Matter movement as a threat, that it will oppress them, when in reality it's a call for help and a call for equality. Minorities in America should not have to worry about their safety, and when they speak out against their experiences with violence in the justice system, a system that is supposed to protect them, they should not have to deal with people who say that they're oppressing the oppressors. Racism is a system that benefits white people, regardless of whether or not you agree with it. Racial minorities cannot, by definition, benefit from racism.
Not to mention, people are sometimes resentful that it gets the attention that it does.
You've got to be inclusive. You can't sit there and say, I'm just addressing one group. And I think it's very insulting to say, well, white people don't understand it. What are you talking about? You're part of the problem then if you're casting dispersions that way and speaking and labeling all white people, saying that they don't understand the issue or they can't relate to it. That's really not giving people much credit, isn't it?
First of all, well, I think it's very insulting to say that white people don't understand it. Can you honestly say that you have experienced a kind of discrimination that Black Americans face in their lives? Have you ever felt unsafe because of your race?
She's basically stating, this isn't about me. I can't relate to this because it's not about me. How can I make this about white people? How can I make this seem like it's an attack on us? If it's not about me, I don't understand. It's a problem, and it's an insult.
So true, and it really only makes the problem worse because then Black people feel more so like their voices aren't being heard. For more on this, we interviewed Buckley Jr., Berkeley Morgan.
When something doesn't directly affect you, you kind of forget about the problem. Like with war and refugee, like we've been in perpetual war since we can remember. But we don't think about that because it doesn't affect us. But overseas, it really affects people. And so we don't really experience racism all the time, especially those who are majority, because you don't experience it, but it still is an issue. It's still something to consider, and that your peers are struggling through, and that trusted faculty, and it's still like a relevant issue. So I think it's really important to not disregard an issue just because it doesn't affect you.
Yeah, and I remember you telling me about when you visited the South.
At a state fair, walk into a tent, and there are just a bunch of white people glaring at me. it was just very uncomfortable, and it took me a second because out here, no one really cares. But when I was over there, it was suddenly like race was all that they saw. They didn't see who I was. All they saw was just, she is not like purely white. She is something, so we don't like that.
So we searched for facts on people of color and justice. There is no doubt that Black and Hispanic individuals are incarcerated much more frequently than white individuals. But the Bill O'Reillys of the world would like to attribute these numbers to Black people committing more crimes. According to the NAACP, which is not affiliated with Black Lives Matter, African Americans make up 1 million of the 2.3 million imprisoned Americans, but do not necessarily commit more crimes. 14 million white people self-report using drugs, and 2.6 million African Americans self-report using drugs. However, African Americans are incarcerated at 10 times the rate of white people.
The difference in arrest records is staggering. There is no logical reason for this unequal ratio in arrests. It just doesn't make any sense. Statistics from the FBI state that 31.2% of people arrested for drug use or possession were African American. However, African Americans made up only 2.6 million of the 16.6 million people that self-reported drug use. That's 15.7% of the self-reported population, yet 31.2% of people arrested for drugs are African American. It simply doesn't add up.
And even if it were true that African Americans commit more crimes, the best approach would be to inquire as to why, whether it be for socioeconomic reasons, less social opportunities, or a more negative attitude towards police officers after watching people of their race be murdered over and over again without justice. Very few of us could reasonably tolerate that without feeling bitter towards the police. Even more irritating, most of these incidents occur without receiving notable media attention. How many of you have ever heard of Simone Marshall?
Simone Nicole Marshall, according to her family, was in a brutal car accident on April 26 in which her car flipped over several times before landing in a ditch. Instead of being taken to the hospital, though, she was taken to the Walker County Jail in Huntsville, Texas, about an hour north of Houston.
And if you keep listening to this report, you'll hear that her sister, Honey Marshall, repeatedly called and requested that she was taken to an actual hospital, to which the police did not comply, and she died.
I think the most disturbing part of this is that instead of being taken to a hospital, she was taken to jail. Her sister said when I talked to her from jail, she complained that her head was hurting and she kept blacking out. Despite the fact that Simone's sister called the police station multiple times requesting Simone to be moved to a hospital, and Simone's own reports of her discomfort and condition, she was instead left to die in that Texas cell.
And we also want to touch on double standards and how victims of color in the media are portrayed differently than victims who are white. As many of us know, after Trayvon Martin was shot, while the police investigation was taking place, he was criticized because traces of marijuana were found in his backpack. George Zimmerman actually said that his parents didn't raise him right. So when private school students use drugs like marijuana, it's not viewed as that bad. It's viewed as pretty typical teenage behavior. But when inner city kids and or African American kids use drugs, they're considered bad, like there's something wrong with them, like it's somehow their fault. There's a more severe stigma attached to that behavior.
That's very true, and we can all see the effects of this harmful stereotype as inner city kids are passed off of those who can't be helped. They're troubled and at risk, and instead of fixing the issues surrounding that community, cities instead increase police forces. And even if you're a Black American and you don't live in the inner city, you're not safe from this racism. I think our society has a very twisted way of thinking when it's anybody but a white guy, that if an individual belonging to a race or gender does anything perceived negatively by our society, they automatically represent their entire race, their entire gender. I feel like that's what's leading to these tragic murders of Black Americans.
So Black Lives Matter has been compared to a civil rights movement. Alicia Garza, one of the co-founders, went on KPBS News and discussed the origins of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Black Lives Matter started actually in 2013 as a national organizing project after George Zimmerman was acquitted in the murder of Trayvon Martin. Folks like Patrisse Cullors and Opal Tometi, who are co-founders of Black Lives Matter, each of us felt deeply that it was important for us to build a base of people who were ready to counter anti-Black racism, which permeates our society. And so Black Lives Matter is really a call and response. It's a response to the virulent anti-Black racism that our society faces and struggles with, and it's a call to action that we take the time to dismantle that.
One of the main differences between Black Lives Matter and the civil rights movement is the means by which people communicate their ideas. Imagine if Martin Luther King Jr. had had a Twitter and how quickly his ideas would have spread. But anyways, the point is that Twitter is irrefutably the main social media platform of Black Lives Matter. The phrase Black Lives Matter or hashtag Black Lives Matter was retweeted over 9 million times in 2016. But we should distinguish between these two phrases. The hashtag itself was coined by Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi after the shooting of Trayvon Martin. The number of tweets with the hashtag Black Lives Matter or related to Black Lives Matter showed a large spike in August of 2014 after Michael Brown's murder during the initial Ferguson protests. Afterwards, there was a period of lull until
Okay, here's what I've learned, Anderson, from a source close to Darren Wilson, that his representatives have, through a process of deduction or elimination, they have decided that there is going to be no indictment. They're saying there's going to be no indictment because at this point, if there was an indictment, that Darren Wilson would have been asked to surrender himself.
Thus, with the non-indictment of Darren Wilson, there was another surge in the popularity of hashtag Black Lives Matter.
I feel like it's important to reiterate that Black Lives Matter and hashtag Black Lives Matter are not necessarily the same thing. One is a tool used on social media to gain attention and support for a movement, while Black Lives Matter is the movement. The Black Lives Matter movement has its own website in which viewers can find locations and times of protests, the meaning and intentions of the movement and other related issues, inclusive of specifically Black females and Black members of the LGBTQ+ community. For all our listeners who are interested in learning more about the movement, you can visit the site www.blacklivesmatter.com.
What is Black Twitter? According to CNN,
not all Black Twitterers are Black, and not all Black people who tweet are part of Black Twitter. But those who are tweet often about race, pop culture, and issues that interest the Black community.
African Americans are also more represented on Twitter. 11% of African Americans use Twitter at least 3 times a day, while only 3% of white Americans do, as reported by Feminista Jones, a journalist from Salon. Why are African Americans drawn to Twitter? Black Twitter has a powerful influence.
What is powerful about what people term Black Twitter is that, again, Twitter became a platform for us to talk to each other in ways that weren't mediated by dominant culture.
A lot of us don't rely on the mass media. We rely on ourselves and rely on our own voices. We really rely on ourselves as authoritative figures and experts in our own lives and experts in what's going on in the streets.
Other notable hashtags within Black Twitter have been the names of other Black victims like Freddie Gray and Sandra Bland, and also messages like hashtag Say Her Name, specifically targeted towards opposing violence against Black women and girls, and hashtag No Justice, No Peace, which is pretty self-explanatory.
Hashtag Say Her Name is important specifically because a lot of the time the attention is focused on male victims of racially related crimes, such as Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Freddie Gray, and Eric Garner, and so many more, while female victims such as Simone Marshall, Sandra Bland, Mia Hall, etc. go unnoticed. And as a personal side note, how disturbing is it that it would most likely take up half of our podcast time to list the names of those who have lost their lives to police brutality?
Unfortunately, not all of the Twitterverse is supportive of Black Lives Matter. Some opposers attack Twitter users who simply like a Black Lives Matter's post. These attacks usually include incredibly offensive language and vulgar insults.
On Twitter, sometimes I get some rude tweets about my race, and I'm like, okay, troll, whatever, but I've gotten to more, people have begun to attack me out of nowhere because of my race as, Black Lives Matter and Black Twitter becomes more relevant in someone's feed.
So like people see the Black Lives Matter movement on Twitter and then they think that you're a part of that, and these people already dislike Black Lives Matter, so they attack you.
So I'll even just like a tweet, someone says Black Lives Matter, and I'll like it, like, oh, I agree, not even comment, and someone will actually go through the likes, find me, and say, like, oh, go back to Monkey Town.
Are you serious?
No, this has happened, and they're like, yeah, go back to Monkey Town, and they're like, ooga booga. I'm like, what the heck?
What does that even mean?
And they attacked, like, other black people at Buckley. They brought them into the conversation, said, why is your face so, what was it? Why is your face so disfigured like black people's faces are? And they'll just they'll go so low that it almost becomes comical. Like, how could someone just out of the blue attack you for liking a tweet about an issue that you support? I think it's just amazing how, as these issues become more relevant in the media and on Twitter, people are beginning to become more aggravated about it.
It's kind of insane how much discrimination can take place, and yet people will still say that All Lives Matter is a more appropriate slogan than Black Lives Matter.
All Lives Matter isn't a movement. Black Lives Matter is a movement. And it's a much better slogan than All Lives Matter. And as Felonious Monk describes on Larry Wilmore's show on Comedy Central,
if I break my leg, I do not want the doctor telling me all legs should be healed. I want the doctor to fix my leg.
Right. Okay. Got it. Okay, so you're saying Black Lives Matter is a specific cry for something, whereas All Lives Matter is just a way of shutting down that cry.
Yes.
Yes! Right. Got it. Okay, so basically, All Lives Matter is just a non sequitur.
There is not a single sequitur to be found, Brother Larry.
Wilmore and his guest make some great points. The All Lives Matter phrase was meant to be a retaliation of Black Lives Matter. Those who created the phrase are probably the same people who believe in reverse racism, even though, as we've stated earlier, racism is a system that really only benefits white people. A lot of people always seem to focus on what isn't said rather than what is, especially in the media. Black Lives Matter is obviously addressing a specific issue, and some people kind of misconstrue the group's intentions as to mean that only Black Lives Matter, when in fact they're just reiterating the fact that Black lives in fact do matter, a reminder that, sadly, our country's law enforcement needs. Black Lives Matter was never intended to be a harmful or non-inclusive movement. As many have said, and I will restate, Black Lives Matter is not really a movement for white people. And although your voice does matter, we need to hear other voices. To our white listeners, you can and should use your voice to give other people a platform, or the metaphorical megaphone, in order to broadcast their ideas and opinions. We can and should show our support for the Black Lives Matter movement. We just need to make sure we're not talking over those who are closer to the issue.
If we all pitch in and use our voices, or don't use them sometimes, then we are capable of creating positive change. I mean, this organization has successfully raised awareness over the struggles of people who are Black in the United States. Representatives were actually able to meet with Democratic presidential nominees Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. Their protests led to symbolic events such as the resignation of Tim Wolf, the racist president of the University of Missouri. Other esteemed colleges acknowledged their history of racial violence. Georgetown and other universities renamed buildings that had been dedicated to slave owners, etc. The Confederate flag was removed from the South Carolina State House. A street was named after Sandra Bland. The point is that even in the face of adversity, this group has been able to really make progress in the fight for racial equality in the United States, and that is an organization that I think we can all get behind.
Thank you for joining us today on our podcast concerning Black Lives Matter. We hope you enjoyed our riveting session and that all of our listeners will consider what changes you can make in your lives to create a more inclusive environment and support the Black Lives Matter movement. Thank you.